What's up, everybody? Mike Walsh here. So today I want to defend the bench press and say why fighters should indeed bench press, okay? So this is a follow-up to a broader sentiment in the kind of sports S&C, strength and conditioning community, the functional fitness community, and like the specific topic was also inspired by one of my subscribers who left a comment on the video I released yesterday about barbell training for MMA, where my subscriber argued that the bench press in particular isn't a great movement for a few reasons, and his reasons were, amongst common criticisms of the bench press. So I just want to unpack it and make the case for the bench press, make the case for the bench press, not only as a movement in general and exercise in general, but for fighters specifically, and say why the gripes and criticisms are massively overstated and why there is no better alternative to the bench press, frankly. Okay? So, to refresh your memories, I am not just advocating for powerlifting. Powerlifting is 3 movements. It's the barbell, squat, bench, and deadlift. Okay? I advocate for those movements, and additionally, the overhead press, the barbell row, and the chin-up or pull-up. I think those are the 6 foundational lifts for strength training. And I think fighters should be doing those 6 foundational lifts. I think if you're not doing each of those 6, you're kind of fucking up. And yes, there's specific nuanced situations where it's well, I already developed a really strong deadlift years ago, and I'm starting to get older. And yes, the deadlift is, it's a little over-hated as a dangerous lift or a taxing lift, but I've transitioned to a point where I do the back squat still, but I do a different hip hinge. And yeah, there's nuanced situations where you don't have to do all 6 of these things all the time forever. But if you are a career fighter and you haven't put a meaningful time into these lifts throughout your career and haven't achieved certain minimal kind of standards in these exercises, you are neglecting your strength training. And especially if you're it's one thing if you just never strength train. It's one thing if you're doing the Marcelo Garcia thing and you're yeah, I just do jiu-jitsu. I get my conditioning from jiu-jitsu, I get my strength from jiu-jitsu, I do jiu-jitsu. That can work. Okay, and that if that's how you're pulling it off, then okay. And certain athletes can do that. Certain people are just naturally fucking athletic anyways. They're naturally fast. They're naturally strong. And they're just getting extremely good at the one thing they're going to be doing, which is their sport, and they don't really have to do a bunch of S&C on top of that. Fine. But if you do S&C, if you do strength and conditioning, if you're doing shit to get stronger, and it's not including those 6 movements I listed, that's a mistake. Okay? And yes, that's kind of my broader position. And yes, specifically that does include the bench press. And what are the criticisms of bench press? They are a couple. There is the sort of claim that it is sort of this unnatural position where your scapula is retracted and that it creates shoulder impingement. There's sort of that side of it, and then there's the functional side of well, when do you lay on your back and press anything? What's functional about that? And what's funny about the latter is I remember talking to someone about this who I did jiu-jitsu with, and he's, a middle-aged guy, a jiu-jitsu hobbyist, but a smart guy and a real nerd. He's the kind of guy who every time you see him, he's here's this new idea I got from watching this Craig Jones video or from watching this or from that. And he nerds out about fitness stuff as well. And I think he does some training, some extracurricular strength and conditioning beyond his hobbyist jiu-jitsu training. But I remember talking to him once about barbell training and specifically the bench press. And he's well, when would you ever be on your back and be pushing something? And whilst he was saying that, live rolls were happening on the mat directly in front of us. And I just looked at him and then looked at the mat and kind of gestured at the mat and was like that. And he's oh yeah, I guess. And, and some of you might immediately leap at me and say, Well, no, on the mat in jujitsu, when you're doing shit off the back, you're never like literally having someone like lay across your chest and pushing them. You know, you're never doing that scene in Batman Begins where the fucking like log falls on him when the mansion is burning, and you know where Alfred's like, what's the point of all those push-ups if you can't even lift a bloody log? And then Batman presses it off of himself. Yeah, you're never doing that specific thing. But that's true about all the barbell lifts. Okay, what I mean by that is, like, you do a barbell squat where you put the barbell on your back and squat down. You never, ever, ever do that in a grappling / MMA context. Like, the only time you kind of might would be like a standing fireman carry, right? Where you pull the guy atop of you and then stand up with them on your back. Like that's the most like one-to-one movement, and that's an incredibly uncommon situation. You know, more common would be things like, oh, I get a double leg and I hike you up, or I do the Daniel Cormier where I get to I keep wanting to say run the pipe, not a single leg, a high crotch. You get to that high crotch position where you come through like this and hoist them and they tip that way. Terrific. That's not a one-to-one like comparison to a squat, to a barbell squat. You know what I mean? Neither is getting behind someone and hiking them up for a suplex, right, from a body lock. That's not a one-to-one either. And it's not a one-to-one for anything, right? Like there's no exercise that one-to-one recreates these things outside of like just doing the thing itself or taking a human-sized dummy that moves like a human and picking that up or something. Because even front squats and Zercher squats and sandbag work and so on and Atlas stones and so on are not perfectly mimicking anything in the sport. You know, the only way to perfectly mimic getting the Daniel Cormier high crotch and like hoisting the dude in the air is to just do that to people. You know what I mean? And some people do that. Like some people use that kind of shit for their strength and conditioning, like Mirko Krokop. Apparently, I've seen training footage where later in his career, he kept just doing that stuff. He was like, instead of lifting weights, I'm just going to do shit like that. I'm going to have someone like, get me in a headlock and I'm going to pick them up 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 and I'm going to have them get on top of me and I'm just going to like bridge press them off and bridge press them off and bridge press them off 4 reps for the purposes of building kind of strength endurance for MMA. Now, there's an argument for that. Yeah, even there, that's like Krokop late into his career after having lifted shitloads of weights. I heard in the distant past that Krokop had like a 330 bench press, for example. So that's after that, and that's him late in his career after the UFC blasting gear like a motherfucker over in Japan. You know, so at that point, you know, do whatever you want, I guess. But aside from that kind of stuff, like you're not replicating the sport with anything. Okay, and that includes like functional movements, that includes strongman lifts, that includes odd lifts, again, Zercher lifts, that kind of stuff. None of that is like simulating the sport perfectly. So if that's your indictment of the bench press, is like, well, I would never quite literally be on my back, like flat, but with my feet below the rest of my body and be pressing something like directly like this. I would just never do that. It's like, well, yeah, you would also never overhead press something in a fight. You would never do a chin-up in a fight. I mean, it's like, you might use those muscles and you might do things that partially resemble those movement patterns in some way, shape, or form, but you're not going to literally do them. And you do things, though, that involve the muscles that you develop from bench pressing. Like if you want to develop upper body pressing strength, the bench press is the best movement. It's better than the overhead press. Like I think you should do both, but if you could only do one, I would have you do the bench press. Because the bench press is a more comprehensive like movement in terms of working muscles. Because the overhead press so heavily neglects the chest. It hits the shoulders more, but the bench press also hits the shoulders. Not to the same degree, but it does hit them. And it develops the chest. And the chest is an important muscle. I know it's a mere muscle. I know it's an aesthetic muscle. But it's an important muscle. It's massive for a reason. Yeah. That's like kind of a clue to a muscle's importance, right? Like the lats are a big muscle for a reason. The chest is a big muscle for a reason. The glutes are big muscles. The quads and hamstrings and whatnot are big muscles for reasons. Yeah, there's a reason they're bigger than the bicep. So, if you could only do one, I would have you do the bench press. And people might immediately get in on that, but like, oh, but the overhead press is so functional because you have to stand when you do it, and there's more, there's kind of balance involved, and your core is more involved, and blah, 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 blah. It's like, yeah, but that's also true for like the squat, and kind of more true for the squat in a lot of ways. Like you're doing stuff to train your torso with the squat and the deadlift. The overhead press helps in that department, don't get me wrong, but in terms of like developing pressing strength, developing the front muscles, and by front I'm lumping the triceps in there, even though anatomically it's like a back muscle. But in terms of developing the shit you're not developing, pulling, the bench press is better than the overhead press. That's why it's an important movement. And you do use, like, again, those muscles and kind of deviations from those movement patterns in fighting all the time. You do squeeze people. You do push people. You do frame on people. You do shit like that frequently in fights. And yes, that's using combinations of your triceps and shoulders and chest. It's an important movement. If we were to rank all of them, it wouldn't be the very most important. I think pulling muscles are more important for grappling than pressing muscles are. But so if you were for some bizarre hypothetical reason, if God came down and said you're forbidden to do more than like 2 exercises or something, although shit, even like if you could only do 2 movements, it might be like the deadlift and the bench at that point, or the squat and the bench. Because you'd still be developing the posterior with the deadlift and then working on those things with the bench press. So you'd still have an argument. If you could only do 1 movement, it wouldn't be the bench press. Yeah, it'd be like the squat probably. But you are not forced to only do 1 movement in real life. So it's silly to go down that line of thinking. So as far as the other indictments of the bench press, as far as but your scapula is retracted and your shoulder impingement and it makes your shoulders inflexible and yada yada, it's like there's a few things here. Okay, so the scapula retraction is done for a reason, like that, and locking your lats down, like depressing, that would be depressing your shoulders, right? But locking in like this is important. That allows you to exert more force. And that's actually helping your shoulders stay healthy. What's really going to fuck your shoulders up is this shit during bench pressing. And sometimes you get tempted to do that. Like if you're struggling on a rep, sometimes your instincts are to kind of almost go over it like this, almost kind of flare out the elbows and kind of roll the shoulders forward and try to kind of do that with it almost. I'm exaggerating, of course, but that instinct is there. And that sort of flared elbow, internal shoulder rotation shit, that's what's going to tweak your shoulder if you're bench pressing. Locking it in like this and tightening your lats and pressing here, this is a very strong position. So it might, if you're saying it's unnatural in the sense that you don't do it in a lot of other stuff, meaning if I throw a punch, if I throw a right cross, I don't keep my scapula back here, right? It's not like karate, right? Where everything's depressed here and I'm not doing, rotation and not doing scapular protraction where I reach like this, right? Yeah, that's not how you actually punch in a fighting context. But so what? You're not trying to mimic a punch with the bench press. You're trying to develop strength and muscle. And to develop strength and muscle, the best way to do that is, yes, to suck the goddamn scapula back and tighten the lats and depress the shoulders and press, with your elbows at more of a 45-ish degree angle than a high angle like this. That is the kind of best way to bench press. And this gets into a whole debate about bench press technique and about bench press as a competition lift and an ends unto itself versus as a developmental tool. And I'm not suggesting like in terms of that debate, that you need to bench the way competition bench pressers do, because they, yes, are trying to maximize mechanical advantages, right? Like, and I'm not going to demonstrate it right now because I'd have to adjust the camera and everything, but like, maybe I'll do it in a different video, like bench pressing technique for fighters or something. But like competition bench pressers, they're really getting up high. Like they're not merely getting a little arch in their back and pulling their scapula back and tucking down their shoulders. They're rolling up onto their traps and creating this massive like banana bend in their spine and really creating shitloads of leg drive and pushing themselves back like this, back and down into the bench itself, and creating as much of a decline position, more of like a dip position than a standard like horizontal press position. They're doing that as much as they're able to because, again, mechanically, that's like the best way to move the most weight. There's a real argument, and I subscribe to it, that that's not the best way to develop strength and muscle from the bench press. So if you're using the bench press, again, as a developmental tool to just build general strength and muscle versus a thing that's the end unto itself where you're trying to move the most weight possible, then yeah, I don't think you should bench that way. And people who do bench that way, like competition bench pressers, typically have a lot of specialized like assistance and supplementary lifts that help develop. They're the developmental tools, and the bench press is the thing they're developing. Whereas we would want to use the bench press as the developmenting tool, or the developing tool. And some people go really far with that, and in some contexts, in a bodybuilding context, there is an argument for it. So some bodybuilders, definitely believe you should bench press with the elbows flared like this, because it kind of maximizes this action that the pec does. And similarly, they try not to bench with much of an arch or their scapula's back. They want more range of motion because they're trying to get more squeeze from the chest. And there's an argument for that, and that already starts getting into other arguments about the values of range of motion versus like moving more weight, and like volume versus intensity, and all kinds of shit that matters in the bodybuilding context. I'm not going to unpack that here. I'm just going to tell you that if you're a fighter, you are not a bodybuilder. You're not doing the bench press just to kind of maximize its potential as a chest developer in terms of putting mass on your chest, any more than you're trying to do it in a powerlifter's like method, and a powerlifter's technique, where you're just maximizing the mechanical advantages for yourself. You're trying to do it in a way that develops, yes, muscle mass, but more importantly, strength. And in that department, I would say, yeah, do it in a more modest, but still kind of powerliftery way. Do it with a mild arch. Do it with some leg drive. Do it, yes, with your scapula back. Yes, with your shoulders depressed. Yes, at more of a 45 rather than 90-degree angle. Yeah, do all those things, but just don't go nuts with it. Don't do a full-blown, like, what's his name, Mendelson or J.M. Blakely, like the big bench pressers. Don't do arches like those guys. Don't do it like they're doing it. But yeah, get some good stability. That allows you to generate more force and really develop the muscles in question. Because that's why compound lifts are important. When the muscles work synergistically, they can produce more force than they can independently. That's why even bodybuilders, even the people that want to fuck with the bench press to like really target their chest more or whatever, even they are still doing bench press rather than like isolation chest movements and tricep movements and shoulder movements alone, right? I've not come across anybody who exclusively thinks, I don't care what kind of bodybuilding, specialist you are. I don't care what kind of, I don't need to bench press 500 pounds. I just need to look like I bench press 500 pounds type of dude you are. I've yet to meet one at a high level or who's a serious competitor or serious coach who claims that you should only do isolation movements, that you should never do compound movements. So that's why classically the compound movements are kind of viewed as the mass builders, and the isolation movements are sort of the icing on top. They're a way to hit the areas that are a little neglected, or that the compound movements don't hit every muscle equally, so sometimes you need some extra work for certain things. So that's kind of classically been the purpose of those things. And circling back, like the point of the bench press is to develop strength and size in the major pressing muscles, the chest and the triceps and the shoulders to a lesser degree. And it is the best movement for that. You should also overhead press. And there are benefits to the fact that you are standing, and that works your torso more, and that's cool. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't bench press. And the sort of functional complaints that, well, I never literally bench press in a grappling match. Well, you don't literally do anything. You don't literally deadlift in a grappling context. You don't literally deadlift in real life. You pick up objects off the floor, but never like this perfect symmetrical bar that's very easy to grip and that's like all the way up to your shins so that the leverage is ideal. It's not like out in front of you. You'd never do that in real life. Does that make the deadlift not functional? Of course not. So that's the wrong way to look at it. And similarly, the stuff about the scapula is missing the point. That's you're doing that to keep the shoulders safe, actually, and to allow yourself to press with more force, which develops more strength and more muscle. And then, the only thing I didn't touch on is the shoulder impingement thing. If you're stretching and doing overhead pressing and not chasing like titanic strength numbers, the bench press is probably not going to create any issues. And I say that anecdotally. I say that from like knowing plenty of people who lift with barbells and do jujitsu. Like one of the guys at my gym currently, he's an older guy. He's not like super old, but he's like 40. And he's one of the strongest guys at the school because he does barbell lifts. He's a little bit smaller than I am, but he's quite strong. And he's got like a 285 pound bench press, which is pretty good. And he's older than I am again, and he's a grappler, and he does that, and he doesn't have like weird shoulder issues from it. To name but one example, one anecdote. I think if you really push it hard, if he were to really aggressively say like, I really want the 315 or a 340 or whatever, then eventually that might create issues. But that's not what you need. You just need like intermediate levels of strength to be a fighter, to be a competent fighter. Islam Makhachev is one of the stronger pound for pound fighters in the UFC. He doesn't have freaky elite numbers or nothing. He just has like pretty good numbers. He has numbers that can be achieved in a few years by a lot of people. Not everyone, but by a lot of people. Like you should be able to deadlift like twice your body weight and bench press something like 1.25 times your body weight, and so on and so on. You should be able to hit these numbers with these lifts within a few years. Like if you're a fighter, you should be able to hit those numbers before you get to the UFC. If you start training when you're like 17 or something, and you've got to do a little bit of training before you even have your first fight, and then you have a few fights, and you don't actually get signed to the UFC until you're like 23, 24, like some arc like that. Like between the ages of 17 and 24, you should have achieved all of these numbers, because that's incredibly doable, even with the limitations of like balancing it with an MMA schedule. If you've been weight training, if you've been doing SNC training for all that time and you can't deadlift twice your body weight, like something is wrong. You are doing the wrong things and probably need to fire your coach because he's a fool. So, and yes, circling back, trying to stay on topic, the bench press is a staple. You're not going to get the same results from anything else. You're not going to get it from push-ups. You're not going to get it from any sort of ballistic, like medicine ball throws off my back. You're not going to get the same results. You're not going to get it from even dumbbell bench pressing, which is like second best. If you somehow don't have barbells and you only have dumbbells and you're like, oh no, what's a guy to do? It's like, do dumbbell bench pressing. It's second best. It's not as good as the barbell, but it's still good. It's not all or nothing. These things exist on a good, better, best kind of continuum. But the best for developing strength in this specific department, in this movement plane and with these muscles, is the bench press. So those are my thoughts on that. Let me get my knife back here. I set it down so I can demonstrate things. Those are my thoughts on that. Let me know what you think down below. Like if you have not, subscribe if you have not. Check out my other YouTube channel if you have not. It's called Michael Walsh Nerd Stuff. I will link it down in the description box. On that channel, I talk about nerd stuff. I talk about comic books, video games, anime, sci-fi, all that kind of shit. If you're interested in that stuff, go check it out. If not, no worries. Just stick around here. But in any case, take care.